Good afternoon, everybody. I guess this isn't a real meeting because they didn't give me a gavel. So we'll just bang on the desk. But welcome, everybody. This is a rather extraordinary event. Just talking a minute ago, we don't think we've ever had all of our commissions and council under one roof at one time. So it's about time. It only took us 25 years. So it's a good idea. But I would like to call this meeting to order. For the record, Madam Clerk, we will need to take roll. Take roll. Here.
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 Edwards. Here. And
Right on time. Oh.
we'll also go ahead and note the roll for the boards and commissions off the sign-in sheet for a joint meeting.
Great. Thank you very much, Randy. And also, because this is an officially noticed meeting, we do have to open up to public comment. So is there any public comment? Anybody care to speak? Okay, then we'll dispense with the reading of the rules then. Item 1, and the only item on the agenda, is concerning board and commission training, conflict of interest as it pertains to the Ralph M. Brown Act. So just a few words of welcome. Again, this is rather extraordinary, and it really has come about because of the work of one of our subcommittees. I believe it was Mrs. Edwards and Mr. Nagar, who is ill tonight, by the way. In looking at the role of our boards and commissions over our history, what it's been, where the successes have been, maybe where there have been some shortcomings, not necessarily with you individually, but in the process. And what's ideal and how do we get there? And so really that discussion was kicked off, culminated in a handbook, which you should all have, I think, by now. That's also a first. And really the desire amongst the city, amongst the council, to see more engagement from our commissioners. And from what we've heard over the years, I would think and I would hope that you would welcome that as commissioners. In the past, we've kind of got lulled into a place where things come down from the council or from staff, and you address them at your meetings or sometimes outside of your meetings. And we want to let you know it's okay for things to come up. Take more initiative, be more involved, be more visible out in the community, things like that. And mostly we wanted to let you know that's okay. In fact, it's to be encouraged. So with that, we'll kick it off. Do we have any comment from any of our other? Marianne, as a member of the subcommittee, what have you got?
Thank you. Well, I asked, when we were going to kick this off, I wanted to do a skit, and Peter said, no, you can't do a skit. No, it's too much, might get in trouble, can't do a skit. I said, well, could we do something else? No, you probably better not. We're going to stay out of trouble. Don't want to say too much. So I want to tell you, as a new commissioner, do you remember your first commission meeting?
No.
Oh my gosh.
Although I do still have the agenda for my first council meeting in 1997.
Do you, Chuck? Do you remember your first Murrieta council meeting?
I do. I was going to say, does that suffice for a commission meeting?
Yeah.
Serving on the Murrieta Council?
Do you remember?
Yes, I do.
Were you quiet and afraid to say anything, or?
No, I was stupid and blabbing.
Okay, that's perfect. That's a perfect lead-in then. So, Matt, do you remember your first time in a classroom or on an official board where you were maybe videotaped or taped or live or? No,
Unfortunately.
No. Well, you
I
remember.
do remember my first.
You remember your first council
it was
meeting?
just last week.
Yeah.
Oh, those many years ago.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah. So you did fine. I mean, you weren't totally quiet, but you were reserved, and you thought about what you were going to say. So new commissioners, raise your hand. Any new commissioners? Okay. So fairly new commissioners, right? So I remember my first commission meeting, and it was a Public Traffic Safety Commission, and back in 1997 or 98, there were a lot of things going on with traffic in Temecula, a lot, and a lot of people were not happy. A lot of people, most people were not happy. So our commission meetings were very lively, and we had a lot of people in the audience. Sometimes it was overflow in the old council chambers, and so I just remember lots of public comments, and I remember that I spoke, and I remember being careful, but I really didn't think about it too much. But, you know, just neighborhoods and your neighbors, and people were very passionate about what they were saying. And I remember picking up the Californian off the driveway the next morning. Those were the old days, huh? And seeing my name in the, not the big headline, but the littler headline above the box, and something that I had said. And it was good. Fortunately, it was good. And I remember getting that feeling in the pit of my stomach. It never dawned on me, thinking, I can never say anything again. Just remembering that anything that I would say from that point on could be in the headlines of the paper. And so that's really where you are right now. And so that can be a really good thing, or it can be one of those aha moments that you have when you wake up the next day. And not only will it won't be just in the paper laying on the driveway, it's on the internet, and it never, ever goes away. So you have the ability to make a huge, huge difference on behalf of the city and behalf of all your friends and neighbors and your residents. And it's a wonderful opportunity. And I had a fabulous time as a commissioner, and I went everywhere. I went to all the city meetings, grand openings. If we were to study a bridge, I was at that bridge from the time it was under construction. You know, I would go weekly to watch. I had a great time as a commissioner.
Were you included in the homeless count? Were you sleeping out at that bridge?
Yeah, yeah. You know what? I went to all kinds of things like that. Even if it wasn't part of traffic and safety, I went to all kinds of things. And that's how you learn. That's how you learn about your city and about how things are done at the city. So I just encourage you, get involved even in things that aren't necessarily involved with your commission. That's how you learn how things are done. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Mary Ann. One thing you said has always been interesting. We've heard it a lot in our travels. A good guiding principle is never say and do anything that you don't want to have show up as the headline in a
You bet.
newspaper. Kind of keeps you focused. Chuck, anything further, Matt?
Oh, I just say real quickly that I'm actually really thrilled because I got a chance to talk with a lot of you over the last year, and I think a lot of our conversations, there's a lot of synergies out there, and so keeping everybody in their silo and not communicating, I think, is a big disservice to the commissions and the city, and so I'm really excited to see everybody get together in the room and start moving forward.
Good. Thank you, Matt. Just a couple of housekeeping items. There will be a period for questions and answers after some of the presentations you'll hear concerning conflict of interest and the Brown Act. Also, there'll be some refreshments available. I see them setting up now outside after the meeting if you'd like to stay for that. And finally, for those of you who have never signed the city's value statement, you'll have an opportunity to do that in the just outside the doors, I believe, right? And you need to do that because that's an important part of the acknowledgement of how we do things and what we do here. So with that, first presentation you're going to get is from City Attorney Candace Lee. Candace works together with Peter Thorson, who's our day-to-day city attorney. So Candace, it's all yours.
Excuse me. Thank you, Honorable Mayor and members of the council and members of all the commissions here. It's a pleasure to be here to present on the Brown Act this evening. I serve as the Assistant City Attorney in Planning Commission Council, and I also serve as a City Attorney in the City of Agoura Hills. So we'll kick it off with the Brown Act. Let's see. 1 second. So this evening we'll be going over the Brown Act, which is California's open meeting law, and then Peter Thorson will be going over conflicts of interest laws. Before you on the slide, you see Ralph M. Brown, who is the legislator who authored the Ralph M. Brown Act, otherwise known as the Brown Act. And the Brown Act was enacted in 1953. Truly in response to a 10-part series by the San Francisco Chronicle entitled Your Secret Government, which revealed that secret meetings in governmental agencies were actually quite common. And since 1953, the Brown Act has evolved under a series of court decisions and amendments, but the central rule of the Brown Act has not changed since its passage, which is that all meetings of a legislative body of a local agency shall be open and public, and all persons shall be permitted to attend any meeting of the legislative body of a local agency. And this policy really underscores two major themes: that transparency in government is a good and desirable thing, and number two, that process is important. I'm going to be covering 4 basic topics regarding the Brown Act. Number 1, to whom does the Brown Act apply? Number 2, what is a meeting? 3, what rules apply to meetings? And 4, what are the remedies for a violation under the Brown Act? So the first major question is, to whom does the Brown Act apply? And they apply to legislative bodies. And that leads us to the question of, well, what is a legislative body? And a legislative body includes any body that has decision-making authority, whether elected or appointed. So in the case of the council, elected, and in the case of all the commissions here, you are appointed. So it includes city councils, but also includes subordinate bodies such as boards, commissions, committees, and task forces. So if you belong to a commission created by the city council, you are a member of a body subject to the Brown Act. You should know that the Brown Act also applies to standing committees with a regular meeting schedule that have continuing subject matter jurisdictions. An example would include a budget committee that meets regularly throughout the year over a number of years. Interestingly, the Act does not apply to ad hoc committees. These are committees that are comprised of less than a quorum, and they're usually created to deal with a singular issue. So for example, a number of years ago, I served on the Heritage Tree Commission with a couple of, standing committee with a couple of council members, and we talked about the Heritage Tree Ordinance. And then once we had actually gone through all the issues and adopted the ordinance, that advisory committee rather, basically dissolved because we completed our mission, which was to adopt the Heritage Tree Ordinance. There are 4 major elements to a meeting, and a meeting is a congregation of a majority of a legislative body at the same time and place to hear, discuss, or deliberate any item within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. So in essence, a meeting is a gathering of a majority of the members of your council or commission to hear, discuss items relating to the city. It's important to note that serial meetings are illegal. And what is a legal serial meeting? It is a direct or indirect communication, and an indirect communication would include intermediaries or technological devices. It would be employed by a majority of members to develop a collective concurrence as to a specific action to be taken. And there are 2 main types of serial meetings. The first one is a telephone or email chain where you will have a Commissioner A contact Commissioner B contacts Commissioner C, and so forth and so on until you basically obtain a collective concurrence on a particular issue. The second type of serial meeting involves one single person that disseminates information and collects information from the other commissioners. So it's otherwise known as a hub and spoke. So you'll see in the slide the wheel, the hub being the center. Interestingly, a hub can be someone who is not a member of your commission or your city council member. It could be a staff person, a lobbyist, any member of the public that basically collects information as a conduit of information. So in this case, that particular person will receive information for various members, gets their opinions, and then acts based on those discussions with the various council members or various commissioners. Individual briefings with staff are permitted, and that's very common, but we always have to be very careful about that. We typically advise that the briefings be unidirectional, so staff will provide the information. It's okay to ask questions, but you should really refrain from expressing your opinion or any direction on a particular matter. There are several meeting exceptions. So when is a meeting not a meeting? It's It's common for new commissioners or council members to say, gosh, it seems so difficult. How am I supposed to have conversations with people and not get in trouble under the Brown Act? So luckily we have these meeting exceptions. So the first one, individual contacts between two council members or two commissioners, that's fine. So long as you don't use those communications to develop a serial meeting or a collective concurrence, that's fine. Another exception includes meetings and seminars. So oftentimes we'll have members of legislative bodies attend the League of California Cities conference, and that would not constitute a meeting. But the conference has to be open to the public and limited to issues of general interest. And when members of a particular legislative body are at these conferences, they cannot discuss city business among themselves. A third exception includes community meetings, whether that's a town hall forum or Chamber of Commerce event, luncheon. Again, those are not meetings, but again, they need to be open to the public and publicized. An example of what is not an exception would be a homeowners association meeting. Those are typically not open to everybody, so that would not qualify. It's important to note that members of a legislative body can attend the meeting of another legislative body, but again, you need to avoid discussing items of city business. Other examples of meeting exceptions include serial and ceremonial events, so long, again, as you don't talk about city business at that meeting. Again, ad hoc committees are not subject to the Brown Act. And with standing committees, members of a legislative committee or legislative body who are not members of a standing committee can attend that particular standing committee meeting, but again, only as observers. There are four main types of meetings. You have your regular meeting, your special meeting, adjourned meetings, and emergency meetings. For the vast majority of you, you're only going to ever have to worry about regular meetings. And the Brown Act rules governing meetings require two essential elements, which are effective notice and an agenda that adequately describes the items to be considered. For regular meetings, as you probably know, your agenda needs to be posted at least 72 hours before the meeting. Again, regular meetings are the normally scheduled meetings that you have at a set time and place, once or twice a month, however often you meet. So for the Planning Commission, it's the first and third Wednesdays of the month at 6 p.m. And it's important to know, also the agenda needs to be posted in 3 places that are accessible to the public. And the agenda needs to briefly describe the items of business, and this includes a CEQA action. So if you have a development plan, zone change, perhaps a general plan amendment at your Planning Commission meeting or your City Council meeting, and as part of that decision, you are going to, whether you adopt an EIR, a negative declaration, or declare an exemption, that CEQA action also needs to be described in the agenda. It's important to note that the public needs to be given an opportunity to speak on any item listed on the agenda, and also they can speak on any non-agendized item that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of your particular legislative body. Special meetings. These can be called by either the presiding officer, usually that's the mayor or the chairperson, or by a majority of your particular legislative body, whether that's the council or the commission. For special meetings, the agenda only needs to be posted 24 hours in advance. If there are members of the public or the press that have requested advance notice of these agendas, they need to obtain written notice unless they've waived them. And for special meetings, the public can only be allowed to discuss and address items listed specifically on the agenda. Adjourned meetings. Adjourned meetings are a regular special meeting that is adjourned to a specific time or place, and a notice of adjournment must be posted on the door of the meeting chamber within 24 hours of the adjournment. If there's no time stated, then the meeting automatically is continued to the hour for regular meetings. and a meeting can be adjourned for lack of a quorum. In fact, that's probably one of the more common reasons why a meeting might get adjourned. And it can be adjourned by the clerk or secretary of your legislative body, or the members that are actually present for the meeting. The last type of meeting is an emergency meeting, and hopefully you won't have to run into many of these type of meetings. Usually means something not so great has happened. The grounds for calling an emergency meeting are severe impairment to public health and safety, such as a natural disaster or other crippling activity. The press has to be informed 1 hour before the meeting, and if phone service is out, the press must be notified immediately after the meeting. And in the case of a dire emergency, the press only needs to be notified at or near the time of the meeting. And dire emergencies truly are dire. It means mass destruction, terrorist act, or a threat of imminent terrorism. Other general agenda requirements include, again, as we mentioned earlier, that agendas must be posted in publicly accessible locations. In addition, they must be distributed to any party who requests copies of the agenda. Again, another important limitation is that only items set forth on the posted agenda may be discussed. However, for regular meetings, sometimes you can add additional items to the agenda if you meet certain criteria. So you can add items to an agenda if that particular item came to the agency's attention after the agenda was posted, and the need to take action occurs before you can meet for the next meeting. Finally, you need a 2/3 vote in order to add the item. There are exceptions to the agenda requirement. There are brief responses to comments or questions. You don't need to agendize that. Oftentimes, council members or commissioners will ask for clarification from staff, and it's okay to have a simple question from the commissioner and then have staff answer that question. Brief announcements, commissioner reports on activities. If you serve on an ad hoc committee and you want to give a brief report on what you've been doing in the ad hoc committee, that's permissible. It's permissible for requests for future reports from staff, and it's also permissible for you to ask staff to place items on a future agenda. Those don't need to be expressly placed on an agenda. And let's talk about public comments at meetings. One of the central ideas behind the Brown Act is to encourage this marketplace of ideas. And that entails allowing members of your public to speak on items listed on your agenda. And so the Brown Act also prohibits you from banning public criticism of a policy, a procedure, or official. And this is really designed to make sure that free speech isn't hampered or chilled. As part of the public participation process, a commission or council cannot require someone to register, such as a sign-in sheet at the door. We typically use speaker cards, but if someone refuses to fill out the speaker card, we still must allow them to speak. And oftentimes, legislative bodies will adopt rules of decorum and procedure, such as time limits on speakers and precluding speakers from disrupting the meeting. The public can also record the meeting. Perhaps you've seen someone from the audience hold up their iPhone or their camcorder, and that is allowed under the Brown Act. Again, we don't want to hamper free speech and First Amendment principles. We want to allow people to have as much access to what's going on in these public meetings. Usually the commissions don't hold closed sessions, but you may have heard City Council holding closed sessions. And the Brown Act allows a council to hold closed session in very limited circumstances. And that's typically, you'll see them in personnel matters and labor negotiations, because those can be sensitive issues, real property negotiations, pending, threatened, and contemplated litigation. And the point of these exceptions is to allow a council to be able to discuss freely and negotiate on behalf of the public so as to not lose its negotiating power. For example, it'd be very, very hard to negotiate the terms of a real property purchase in front of everyone if the seller or buyer knows what the maximum amount the city is willing to pay for a particular piece of property. Lastly, let's discuss enforcement and consequences. Before anyone can sue for a violation of a Brown Act, they must give the legislative body notice of the alleged violation and an opportunity to cure the violation. Usually the notice is within 90 days of the alleged violation, and then the body has 30 days to cure. And the easiest way to do this is to simply place it on an agenda, whether you have to renotice it and rehear the item. That's the simplest and easiest way to cure. Another possible consequence is a civil action to invalidate a particular action. Interested persons usually include private citizens and newspapers. And courts tend to be very strict against governmental agencies, but the standard is substantial compliance with the Brown Act. It's not absolute compliance with the Brown Act. The person alleging the violation must show that the violation resulted in prejudice. So if someone was unable to attend a meeting because they wanted to say something about a matter, that might be considered prejudice. But if 50 people show up to the meeting and they all said the same thing that you said, and the decision went your way, it's not necessarily going to be prejudice on your behalf because you had a large group of people saying the same thing that you basically said. The Brown Act does have a criminal penalty provision, and this requires an intent to deprive the public of information. So that intent element is key. If you are found guilty of the criminal penalty provisions of the Brown Act, then you'll be guilty of a misdemeanor. Practically speaking, this is extremely rare, but we have seen a trend with district attorneys being willing to go down this path of criminally prosecuting people under the Brown Act, so that's just something to keep in mind. We will be taking questions at the very end, and I'm going to turn over the presentation to Peter Thorson, who will be talking about conflict of interest.
Whenever you're ready, Peter. I'm ready. Then go for it.
I was just going to say.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to explain conflict of interest law to you. I want to emphasize, though, that we're only going to provide an overview of the conflict of interest law. I could sit here and talk with you for about 2.5 hours on all the intricacies of the conflict of interest law. I would love to do it. I could speak off the top of my head, but I don't think many of you would be here much past 20 minutes. But what I
We
want to
love
do
you
is...
so much, Peter, but oh boy.
But what I want to do is I want to make sure that you understand the scope of the conflict of interest law and that you know the questions and you know the issues that come up, so that when you're looking at an agenda and you're wondering whether you have a conflict, you at least have some idea and you're going to know when to call either Candace or myself to ask for some advice. The conflict of interest law, was the primary law is the Political Reform Act. It was enacted in 1974 by an initiative measure, and since then it has been expanded by the legislature. It was created in the wake of the Watergate scandal at a time when states all across the nation were enacting very strict conflict of interest laws. The Political Reform Act, in addition to establishing the standards of conflicts, also created the Fair Political Practices Commission, the FPPC, and that commission is charged with interpreting the act, adopting regulations, as well as enforcing its provisions. The basic conflict of interest law is set forth in the government code, and it says very simply, no public official shall make, participate in making, or in any way attempt to use his official position to influence a governmental decision in which he knows or has reason to know he has a financial interest. And there have been many cases and many regulations since then interpreting it. The basic test, and this is one that is necessary for you to remember, has got really 4 parts. Is it reasonably foreseeable that a governmental decision that you're participating in will have a material financial effect on any of your economic interests? And if you answer yes to those questions, then you need to sit it out and not participate. So what are your economic interests? You have economic interests in real property that you own. You have economic interests in sources of income to you. You have economic interest in any investments or business interests that you may have. You have a definite economic interest in gifts that are given to you and in your personal finances. And we'll walk through those to give you some of the flavor of the types of economic interests that are involved there. Your real property interests start with the fact that if you own or you invest in property of at least $2,000, that real property becomes an economic interest to you. It could be owned by you, it could be owned by you and your spouse together, owned by your spouse separately, or by your dependent children. You also have an interest in any real estate in which you have a lease, because that's an interest in real property. The exception to that is a month-to-month tenancy. If you just rent a house or you rent an office and you only pay monthly rent and you can be forced out or you can leave at any time, that's not considered an economic interest in real property. The next is sources of income. Any source of income to you of $500 or more within the last 12 months is a economic interest. And that's not just one source of income at $500, that's cumulative. So if somebody gives you $100 a month for 5 months, that is a source of income to you. It can be your own income, such as salary from your private employer. It could be income that's promised to you, and that's an important one. As soon as somebody says, I promise to pay you $500 next month, that is a source of income to you at the time the promise is made. It can be your dependent child's income. It can be loan, your spouse or your partner's income, as well as commission income for people in sales. Investments in business interests, again, the threshold is an investment worth $2,000 or more. There is an exception for municipal funds. People have municipal funds for their own investments, for their retirement, and those don't count under the Political Reform Act as economic interests.
Yeah, it says mutual fund here. Mutual fund or municipal funds?
Mutual funds.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I meant mutual funds. And then the business interests that count as economic interests, you have an economic interest in a business if you are in a management or an employment relationship. So be sure to keep that in mind. You also have an interest in the property of the business in which you are invested. So as a public official, you stand in the shoes of whatever business that you've invested in. So you need to be careful and look at all that occurs there. And last but not least is something called the related business entities. Again, when you are invested in a business or you hold stock in a business, you stand in the shoes of that business. And what that means for a related business entity is you have an interest in the parent corporation, you have an interest in the subsidiary corporations, and with respect to limited liability companies or partnerships, you have an interest in any investment that LLC or partnership has, as well as an interest in whatever the management of that LLC or partnership has. So you have to be real careful when you invest to know what other entities and what other investments that business may have. Gifts are an important part of the economic interests. In just a bit, we'll get into a little more detail on gifts, but for many of you, particularly those on the council and myself and the city manager, we are prohibited from obtaining more than $440 worth of gifts in a calendar year. Gifts can be cash, presents that are given to you. Gifts can also be meals, food, and drink. And that's one that you really have to be careful of because, again, gifts accumulate. So if if somebody's buying you dinner a couple of times, 3-4 times a year, that might add up to an amount that may be disqualifying for you at some point in time. Entertainment is a gift. Somebody buys you a ticket to a ball game or takes you to some event at the theater. That is a gift, and you have to be careful about not only reporting that, but not being disqualified as a result of it. And travel and lodging can also count as gifts. Finally, you have an economic interest in your personal finances, and this is really a catch-all. If it's not a source of income, if it's not real property, if it's not a business interest or a gift, the Political Reform Act says anything that will affect your personal finances, that provide some benefit to you, create expenses that you need to pay, that is an economic interest in an economic interest for you. And again, be sure to check on how something might affect your spouse or your dependent children because they count toward your economic interest as well. Okay, the next part of the test for determining whether you have a conflict and must be disqualified is whether the impact is reasonably foreseeable. And that's a relatively simple issue. It's not debated too often, but it's a two-part test. The first part is if the economic interest you have ends up being a party or an applicant involved in a decision, that is a decision that is reasonably foreseeable. In other words, their direct involvement means that it's reasonably foreseeable and that you need to determine whether or not you are disqualified. If the economic interest is not directly involved in the decision, then the test is whether there's a realistic possibility of some impact. Not a hypothetical impact, not a theoretical impact, but a realistic one. Okay, the next part, and this is really the heart of the Political Reform Act and the conflict analysis, is whether there's a material financial effect on your economic interest. And if there is a material financial effect, then you must not participate in the decision. So first, with business entities, there's two parts to that test. First is, and this will sound familiar again, the business entity is an actual applicant or party involved in the decision. So if the business that you're invested in is directly involved in the decision, that clearly is a material financial effect and you cannot participate. The second part of the test is a more subjective one. Would a prudent person with sufficient information conclude that the decision's financial effect on the business entity would contribute to a change in the price of stock or its value? Now that's, as I say, a subjective general description of when a material financial effect occurs, but the FPPC has developed several factors that are looked at. Will your decision result in either increased or decreased competition for the business entity? Does the decision that you're going to be involved in involve the regulation of the business activities of the business you're invested in or similar businesses? Does the decision affect the needs for product or services? Does the decision affect the amount of business, either temporarily or permanently? So while it is subjective, there are these types of factors that you need to look at. And again, these are representative of the several factors that are listed in the FPPC rules. The next item is how do you determine if there's a material financial effect on your real property interest? And this is probably the one that comes up most frequently. And again, the two-part test is the interest in real property in which an official has an interest the actual applicant or party involved in the decision? So if you own property and you're applying to get a permit or a zone change, it's clearly a material financial effect on your property. If your real property interest is not directly involved in the decision, meaning that it's a ways from the decision being made, then the test is whether a reasonably prudent person with sufficient information would conclude that the decision will impact the value of the property. pretty much the same as the business entity description. And again, the FPPC has certain factors that they will look at. And the 3 that I've listed here kind of summarize the 8 or 9 that they list in the regulations. What is the impact on the use of the property of the decision that's before you? What is the impact of the surrounding improvements that may be created by the decision on the property? What is the impact if you're determining whether a road should go close to the property? And then what is the impact of the decision in terms of changing the development potential of the property? Now, that's a lot of decision-making that needs to go on. There's a lot of information that's needed to determine whether there's going to be material financial effect. And I think very quickly, one of the things that you need to look at on real property conflicts is look to the environmental impact report, look to the negative declaration. That's what it's there for. It's designed to look at the potential project to determine if there are any adverse impacts and how to mitigate those. That'll give you a good idea as to how far and what type of an impact there may be on your property. Now, there are several exceptions that we need to talk about. First is that distance matters. The farther the property in which you have an interest is away from the property in which a decision is going to be made, generally, but not always, the less likely it is that your property is going to be impacted. The rule used to be that if you were within 500 feet, you were presumed not to have a conflict. If you were outside of 500 feet, if you were within 500 feet, you were presumed to have a conflict. If you were outside 500 feet, you were presumed not to have a conflict. Well, the FPP changed that. They said they abolished the 500-foot rule, but really what they did is they said, okay, you need to analyze all of the impacts, but if you're within 500 feet of the subject of the decision, you might be able to vote, but only if you apply to the FPPC for a written opinion, and they determine that there's no material financial impact on your property. So it's 2 or 3 bars up the ladder before you'd be able to vote on something close by. The second major exception is a relatively new one, and that is that there is no material financial effect on real property if the effect of the decision is solely concerning repairs, replacement, or maintenance of existing streets, water, sewer, storm drainage, or similar facilities. So if you own your house and they're slurry sealing, if the city proposes to slurry seal the street in front of you, that relates to the maintenance of an existing street, and it's not a material impact on your property, even though you're within 500 feet. And that's new. That's just was adopted about 4 or 5 months ago. Now, if the city proposes to widen the street or to put in some additional improvements, that may trigger the material financial effect. The other issue that comes up a lot in Temecula is homeowner association property. The rule used to be that you had an interest in your HOA's property, which may be quite a distance away from your personal home. The rule now is that homeowner association common area properties are not part of the analysis of material financial effect. So if you live in a development and your home is in the middle of the development and you're, say, 1,000 feet away from the proposed project, but it's right across the street from the homeowner association's open space, it is not a material financial effect and you may still participate. That's a big one, as many people in this town will tell you. The next material financial effect is on a source of income, and that is, again, the 2-part test. And I'm repeating myself with these 2-part tests because over the last 6 months, that is where the FPPC is changing the rules. They used to be far more complicated than this, and now they're going to this more subjective test. So with respect to your sources of income, if you have $500 or more within 12 months of the decision, the rule is you will have a material financial effect if the source of your income is a direct applicant or party to the decision, or if you know or have reason to know that the decision would affect the source of income under the previous standards we talked about for a business entity or real property. Now, the materiality standard for gifts. Generally, there are certain officials in the city that cannot accept any gift which exceeds a cumulative amount of $460 in a calendar year. And those are the elected officials, members of the Planning Commission, the city manager, city attorney, the treasurer, and any officials who deal with the investment of city funds. That's an out-and-out prohibition. No more than $460 in gifts within a calendar year. Now, for the others that are not subject to that, the disqualification rule is if you have $500 or more of gifts within the 12 months prior to the decision, you must disqualify yourself if the donor of those gifts is going to be affected by that decision. And I know when I first read that, I thought, wow, how does that make sense? You got two sets of numbers, but the way to understand it is you are disqualified if you have more than $500 worth of gifts within 12 months, but if you're one of those specific officials, it is illegal to receive more than $460 within a calendar year. So the difference is 12 months prior to the decision or a calendar year. There are a number of exceptions to the gift rules. I haven't listed them all, but this is kind of representative of what they are. It's not a gift if you return it to the donor within 30 days. It's not a gift if you donate it to a 501c3 charitable entity within 30 days. And I might point out, too, that the regulation specifically says 501c3, so you need to make sure that whatever charity you're donating it to has that designation. Your gifts from an immediate family member, gifts provided on a date or in a dating relationship, home hospitality. If you invite somebody over for dinner or invite them to stay with you for a couple of days, it's not a gift. And then there's also a big exception for gifts that are given to the city, and then the city provides those for use by city officials, such as tickets to sporting events or tickets to theater events. There are a number of special conflict rules that you need to be aware of, almost operating as exceptions to the conflict rules. First, there's something called the public generally exception, and that is that if you are going to be affected in a way by a particular decision that is the same as the significant segment of the public, then you do not have a conflict. So if the city is adopting a tax, probably shouldn't use that example, but everybody in the city would be impacted the same way. So even though it does affect you and your property and your business, you would still be able to vote. Another one that comes up, and it's an important one, is legally required participation. You know that we have to have a quorum for all of the commissions to meet. It's generally 3 out of the 5 members, a majority of the members. But say 3 of you have a conflict of interest. Well, all of a sudden you're only down to 2 people, so how do you act? And what the rule says is that if you randomly select one person to come back and make the quorum, then it can act on the item. And that has to be, it can't be just because somebody's absent. You have to have somebody that cannot participate at all rather than just an absence. There's another important exception, and that is for retail business. Thank you. If you have a retail business, you're going to have a lot of customers, and all those customers are theoretically sources of income to you. But if you have a small business and a lot of customers, you're never going to know from one day to the next who is a conflict and who isn't a conflict. So the rule is that if you have a retail business and the sales are open to the public and the customers constitute a broad base of the public, and you have no significant monetary differences in a customer's sales, then you don't have a conflict. So if you have a sandwich shop and you're selling sandwiches and drinks and meals to people during the week and over the course of the year, everybody's going to have generally a pretty close range of what those sales are. But if all of a sudden some big corporation comes in and buys, say, $10,000 worth of food as a part of a conference, that is out of the ordinary, and you may need to deal with a conflict issue there. But the day-to-day sales, as long as they're not significantly different than everybody else, you're probably okay. I made a duplication there, but the other issue that comes up a lot are campaign contributions. And the rules that come out of this are part of what's called the Levine Act. And I only say that because people talk about the Levine Act a lot, so you should know the name of it. The rules are that campaign contributions are not a source of income for elected officials. So the city council members who have campaign contributions, that's not a source of income for them, and it's not a source of income with respect to any decisions made in their elected capacity. So that's city business, TCSD business, successor agency, or housing authority. Campaign contributions can be a source of income for elected officials who are appointed to other regional boards, such as WRCOG or RC, or Riverside County Transit Commission. And that's an oddity in the law, that if you're operating as an elected official, it's not a source of income. If you're acting as an appointed official, it is. The other rule that's, I think, somewhat unfair for commission members is that if you are a commission member and you run for office and you get campaign contributions, but you're not elected, then they are sources of income to you. I don't know that we have any there, but it's kind of a double whammy. You lose the election and then you have sources of income from your campaign contributions. I just want to cover one thing real quick before we conclude, and that is, if you do have a conflict of interest, you have to be very careful in how you deal with it. The rule is not just that you can't vote, it's that you cannot participate. So if you have a conflict, you can't talk to any other members of the council or your commission. You can't talk to the staff about the decision that you have a conflict on, and you can't you can't participate in the meeting. So when the item is called at the meeting, you have to immediately say, Mr. Chairman or Madam Chairman, I have a conflict with respect to this matter because, and you have to state what the conflict is, and then you have to leave the room. And the only exception to that is that if the item is on the consent calendar, you have to state what your conflict is, but you do not have to leave unless the commission takes that matter off the consent calendar and starts to discuss it. And then at that time, you need to leave. The other quick item is that if you have a conflict and it involves your house or something next door to your house, you can speak to the board as a member of the public, but you can only, you can only talk about your personal interests. I live next door, and if this is approved, this is going to destroy my home. I'm not going to be able to see anything. You can't get up and say, this is a bad deal for the city and you shouldn't do it. You can only talk about how it affects your personal house or your personal business. Okay, I think that's it. I've gone over my time. The rest of it is in the book, and it's really just penalties, so.
Peter, that's the first time you've ever gone over your time.
I told you I could talk for 2 hours, but.
No, I know.
I do.
Just a word about our legal team. Peter has been here for a very long time, thankfully as long as I've been here and longer than that. And as someone, excuse me, because of the private work that I do, has probably more potential for conflict than most people, I rely on Peter a tremendous amount to guide me through those issues. And I always find that the easiest way for me to get there is to just make sure that I take Peter into my confidence on everything that I'm doing, and I know others do the same, so that if anything does come up, he knows it before we do, and he can advise us accordingly. So that's always a good way to handle it if you're in that kind of a position. But anyway, do we have any questions on the Brown Act or conflict of interest laws and codes that we talked about? If you do have a question, I'd ask that you come up front so we have it on the record. Everybody understood all that? What are you, crazy? Does get a little complicated sometimes, and often there are things that come up that require a consultation with the attorneys because it doesn't fit in this, cubbyhole or that cubbyhole. So anyway, with that, if there are no questions, anybody up here have any questions? Good job. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I was just curious, you mentioned in one of your last slides the income related to campaign contributions for appointed boards. So that would be all of the RCA, RCHCA, and so forth. So the Form 700 would look substantially different than for that organization submittal?
You know, that's a difficult question the FPPC is grappling with, is the disclosure of the campaign contributions when you're on an appointed board. You have to disclose all of the contributions as part of your campaign statement. So I'm not sure if they reached a decision on how you disclose that on your 700 form. But what I do know is that all of the regional boards make each developer that comes before them fill out a form and indicate whether they have made contributions to anybody on the board. So that should at least help you get to the point where you can see who's coming before you. And it's difficult too because so many developments are organized as a limited liability company or partnership that you could see the name on as an applicant and not really know who's who, but yes.
I have one now.
Go ahead, Marianne. Aaron, you got to wait. Go ahead, Marianne.
I'm working for the state now. I mean, I thought, working for a nonprofit when I was with the Boys and Girls Club, and I still am with the Boys and Girls Club, I never had so many conflicts as that, working in that little clubhouse on the corner, because I was near the creek, I couldn't vote on the creek, grants, I couldn't vote on any of those. So, but now I'm working for the state, so what implications is that going to have? Any?
Well, the conflict rules are the same for the state as they are for the locals. So with the same considerations would apply. What's different, though, is the degree to which you're actually making a decision or participating in a decision on the state. As a director of one of the state agencies, you would be making direct decisions that would affect, businesses and people. But working for a legislator, you're
Not.
like 2 steps removed because
Right.
it has to go to both houses and be approved, and then be approved by the governor.
So that shouldn't be an issue, and we'll just take it one step at a time.
I wouldn't say it's not going to be an issue, but
you never say
the
that.
analysis will be different.
You never say it's not going to be an issue. Okay, thanks.
Aaron?
No, I just I saw some folks taking some notes, and I just wanted to add that after this workshop, our city clerk will be providing copies of all the slides for everyone in attendance, if that's something that will be helpful to everyone going forward.
Great.
And also, too, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call either Candace or myself, and we'll be happy to go over this with you in greater detail.
Thank you, Peter and Candace. Actually, it has absolutely nothing to do with what we were talking about earlier, but it's a question of procedural. By the way, Pat Kite, I'm chairing the Planning Commission this year. And I'd like to recommend, I'll make a recommendation, because I understand that as long as I've been on the commission and as long as some of these others, old guys, have been on the commission, there's a requirement that a representative from each of the 3 commissions attend the city council meetings, which we do. And I always look forward to being here every other Tuesday night. However, having said that, in all the years I've been here, and some of the others even longer, we've never been involved in any discussions at a council meeting. So what I'm recommending is that if there are issues pertaining to our specific areas of expertise, planning, traffic, community services, I think it's appropriate that somebody, a representative from that commission, be at that particular council meeting to help you guys, if we're needed. But if there's not an issue pertaining to planning or any of those, then it seems like we don't need to be there.
Can I address that?
Sure.
And that point is well taken. And one of the things that we've talked about is involving those commissions that are here more in seeking opinions and wanting to know what went on when those items may have been heard at your individual commissions. But I think it goes beyond that. You're here in large part, I would say, in larger part, to carry the message that you hear and see here back to your commissions. So the purpose really was intended to flow the other way, rather than to have that particular input be part of the council meeting. Not that that's a bad thing, it's not, and we would welcome that. But, it's something we certainly can take a look at. We don't want to negatively impact your time any more than it's necessary, but that was really the original intent back. So I remember when we did that, I don't remember what year, but it was to engage the commissions more in council business than it was to engage council in commission business.
And that was probably at a time when we weren't televising the council meetings live.
I don't recall.
Yeah,
It
so-
could have been.
Anyhow, just a
I
thought.
don't recall, yeah. But that's a good point. Thanks, Pat. Anything else? Anything else from up here? Anybody? Everybody's questions asked and answered. Don't forget to join us for some refreshments if you'd like. Don't forget to sign the vision statement, and everybody gets to go home and hear the president tonight. So thank you all for being here, and with that, we'll stand adjourned.
Yay.